Link TV, connecting you to the world. Link TV is viewer supported. Watch more at linktv.org.
Link TV presents Mosaic World News from the Middle East. Here are today's top stories.
Rival demonstrations mark Friday of departure and of national unity in Syria. Egyptians in Tahrir Square demand retribution for January 25th martyrs. And Yemeni protesters call for revolution until victory. Mosaic World News from the Middle East begins now.
In Yemen, massive crowds converged on Freedom and Change squares in various cities across the country, marking what they called the Friday of Revolution until victory. Protesters holding a sit-in called for what they referred to as decisive revolutionaries and for the formation of a transitional council to administer the country's affairs. On the other hand, supporters of Yemeni President Ali Abdullah Saleh gathered in Sabayin Square in the Yemeni capital, marking what they named Steadfast Friday. Meanwhile, mobilization efforts continue both nationally and internationally in a bid to restructure the country's internal front in the post-President Ali Abdullah Saleh era.
All Yemenis wait for Friday. It's the day when both the regime's supporters and opponents tend to flex their power, reflecting on the unfolding developments in the country. Protesters continue to pour into the Freedom and Change squares every Friday, under different revolutionary slogans, with Revolution Until Victory being their latest theme. Despite the different slogans, the objective has been the same, which is the formation of a transitional council that constitutes an official declaration of the downfall of the regime. On the other side, supporters of the regime held a rally dubbed Steadfast Friday, despite their anguish over Saleh's absence. Amid the noise on both sides, a political game seems to be unfolding, with incoming reports confirming that Saleh's absence could last a very long time, or even be permanent. The post-Saleh issue seems to be on the mind of some influential local and international powers. The regime's pillars, starting with the royal family and ending with the smallest beneficiaries of Saleh's rule, are fighting to protect their interests in the new Yemen, or guarantee that they will not be legally pursued, to say the least. Neighboring Riyadh fears that the new Yemen may pose a security and economic challenge if chaos spreads across the country. That same concern is shared by the U.S., which continues to eye al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula. Regardless of the details of the political game, time is running out to save Yemen.
The Yemeni city of Dahmar witnessed protests demanding the ouster of the remaining figures of President Ali Abdullah Saleh's regime and the formation of a transitional council to administer the country's affairs. Joining us from Sana'a is our correspondent, Ahmad Al-Shalafi. Is the size of the masses still huge in both squares?
Yes. First, the protests are being split among the squares across the 17 Yemeni provinces. Of course, the number of these masses is huge. Festivals, events and night forums are being organised in the squares, especially in the Yemeni capital, Sana'a. The aim is to discuss the constitution and the transitional council. This is what is taking place in Sana'a and other squares. You talked about the massive rallies on Friday. It's true, millions of Yemenis have been coming out for days to demand the departure of President Ali Abdullah Saleh's relatives and the formation of a transitional council, marking the beginning of the post-Saleh rule. What's new about today's events is that Hassan Zaida, an opposition leader from the Haq party, announced a short while ago that the opposition will discuss tomorrow the idea of a transitional council, adding that the meeting will include the Houthis and the Southern Movement, as well as other political blocs.
Pro- and anti-regime demonstrations were held in Syria today as United States Secretary of State Hillary Clinton confirmed that time is starting to run out for President al-Assad.
The internal Syrian scene today was of pro- and anti-government demonstrations. On a Friday, the centers have referred to online as the Friday of Departure. Their sites indicate that protests had begun in a number of Syrian cities, including Deir ez-Zur, Al-Hasaka, Idlib, Aleppo, and Latakia. As for pro-regime demonstrators, they chanted in favor of President al-Assad, confirming their support of his comprehensive reform plan. Meanwhile, the Syrian army continues its military operations. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights confirmed that tanks and troop carriers left the village of al-Barra, heading towards the villages of Kfar Nabl and Kansafra in the countryside of Idlib. The organization said 3 people were killed after security forces fired at them in Jabal al-Zawiya. As for the American reaction, U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said time is starting to run out for the Syrian regime and condemned the recent violence in Aleppo.
I'm disheartened by the recent reports of continued violence on the borders and in Aleppo, where demonstrators have been beaten, attacked with knives by government-organized groups and security forces. It's absolutely clear that the Syrian government is running out of time. It doesn't appear that there's a coherent policy coming from Damascus, which allowed the opposition to hold a meeting, then proceeded to carry out more violent acts. We're looking for action, not words, and we haven't seen enough of that. The regime can either engage in a productive dialogue, or it's going to continue to see increasingly organized resistance.
In contrast to Clinton's position, American Congressman Dennis Kucinich announced in a statement released following his visit to Syria that President Assad promised him to withdraw security forces from cities demonstrating against the regime. He said, "Today, we learned that he started the process and is ready to withdraw his forces, not with the aim of remaining in power, but to place Syria on the path towards progress and development." The American congressman said he met Syrians who believed that pushing Bashar al-Assad out of power without knowing who would replace him could render the situation more dangerous. He confirmed that those Syrians want the president to implement the reforms demanded by pro-democracy activists. In the same context, British newspaper The Guardian published an article entitled "The U.S. Presses for Opposition Dialogue with Assad," as revealed by a roadmap for reforms. The article clarifies that Assad will be maintained in power for right now, despite the opposition's demand for his overthrow. The newspaper's report confirms that U.S. State Department officials have been discreetly encouraging discussion of the unpublished draft document, which is currently in circulation. The Guardian said the unprecedented opposition conference held in Damascus did not discuss the document. The roadmap indicates that Assad would oversee a secure and peaceful transition to civil democracy and calls for a number of reforms, including tighter control over the security forces, the disbanding of the Shabiha accused of violations, the legal right to peaceful demonstrations, extensive media freedoms, and the appointment of a transitional assembly. The document demands a clear and frank apology and compensation for the families of victims.
Clinton's harsh criticism of Damascus came as U.S. and European representatives at the United Nations Security Council failed to convince Russia to issue an official condemnation of the Assad regime for its crackdown on anti-government protesters. The disagreement came amid meetings to renew the mandate of the United Nations Observer Force in the Golan Heights, which was unanimously extended by the 15 member states as expected for another 6 months. While the extension is generally a routine matter, controversy arose this year when the European Union supported the inclusion of a condemnation of alleged Syrian abuse of human rights in the initial U.S. drafted text. Russia and China both threatened to veto the mandate renewal if such language was included. The final agreement was reached with no mention of the ongoing crackdown in Syria, although commentary was included over the recent Nakba and Naksa Day violence on the Golan border when several pro-Palestinian activists were killed while attempting to infiltrate Israel.
The Syrian regime's fingerprints are all over these protests. You don't have to be, in my mind, an NYPD forensic expert to detect it. The events that followed the June 5th protests in the Yarmouk Palestinian refugee camp in Syria provide one glaring example of their involvement in the demonstration. I think Bashar Assad is the only ophthalmologist I know who is actively engaged in blackening the vision of hope of his own people and indeed of the whole region.
Turning to Lebanon, where news of the indictment of 4 members of the Hezbollah terror organization with involvement in the 2005 assassination of former Prime Minister Rafiq al-Hariri topped headlines of today's papers. State prosecutor Saeed Mirza today confirmed that he has received the indictments and arrest warrants from the United Nations-backed Special Tribunal for Lebanon, but he declined to name the 4 Hezbollah agents charged with orchestrating a massive bombing that killed Hariri and 22 others back in 2005. There is currently no deadline set for the start of a trial, but the warrants include an order for the prompt transfer of the accused to the tribunal upon their arrest. Hezbollah terror chief Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah has yet to issue a comment, but he is expected to make a televised address on the issue tomorrow evening. Lebanon's former Justice Minister Ibrahim Najjar today said that the nation has only one choice, and that is to fully cooperate with the tribunal, but he expressed his doubt that Hezbollah will do so. Najjar then outlined the option that a special court may then issue the warrants in absentia through international agencies.
If the month ends without serving them, then I think that the pre-trial judge will have to try to serve them in another mean, by publicity, by newspaper, by medias, by television, etc. And if he doesn't succeed, then by abstentia, order will be taken by the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, and it will be served to Interpol or Europol.
In Morocco, ballot boxes were opened today for the nearly 13 million registered voters. They are to vote in a referendum on a new constitution for the country. Moroccan authorities, official media organisations, the most prominent political parties and major unions called for voting yes in the referendum. On the other hand, the February 20th movement that rejects the constitutional amendments called on its supporters to boycott the referendum.
أكثر من 13 مليون مغربي دعوا للمشاركة في استفتاء على
Over 13 million Moroccans were invited to participate in a referendum on constitutional reforms proposed by Morocco's monarch, King Mohammed VI, who vowed to implement additional democratic principles. As polling stations opened, dozens of people voted in a school in Salah near Rabat. Nearly 40,000 polling stations were readied across the country, and 520 stations in embassies and consulates around the world to allow Moroccans to participate in the referendum. Experts on domestic issues believe that the king, who has been ruling the country since 1999, is confident of the implementation of the amendments he proposed, despite the opposition and the calls to boycott the referendum. The king stated in a speech to the nation on June 27th that the plan to review the Moroccan constitution strengthens the foundations of a democratic constitutional monarchy with a parliamentary system of government. The new constitution grants the government executive powers. However, the king would remain as the army's chief and maintain his religious and judicial powers. The king would also still be able to dissolve parliament, but he would no longer be able to do so single-handedly.
حقق الملك البالغ من العمر 47 عاما بعض النجاح في إصلاح إرث من
The 47-year-old king has attained some success in reforming Morocco in terms of human rights violations, illiteracy, and poverty after his father's 38-year rule came to an end. However, his popularity seems to be oscillating between supporters and opposition members. Some view the divide as that of the rich versus the poor and blame the political elite's monopoly on the political arena. The opposition says the amendments proposed by the king are insufficient and that its timing does not allow Moroccans to review the proposal. They confirm their battle will continue until a parliamentary monarchy is established and the king's powers are further reduced. They say he is still holding on to the reins of power. Yola Zarhaddin, BBC. Egyptian protesters returned today to Tahrir, or Liberation Square, to mark what they referred to as the Friday of Retribution and Loyalty to the Revolution's Martyrs. They called for expediting the trials of some of the former regime's figureheads and those accused of murdering protesters during the revolution. The demonstrators stressed the importance of compensating and caring for the martyrs' families. They also called for cleansing the police force from the elements that are working against the nation's interests following the revolution.
The revolutionaries have once again converged on Tahrir Square. They represent a number of different sects and backgrounds. They are gathering once again under different slogans and different demands. Last Tuesday's events played an integral part in today's development. The protesters' main demand is for retribution and the speedy prosecution of those accused of murdering protesters.
We demand their punishment. Since the early days of the revolution, they have been talking about seeking justice for the martyrs and the injured. Money is not a solution. Money will not compensate them for their injuries or bring back their martyred fathers or mothers.
We want to see them tried. We have not seen justice. Mubarak's sons have not been put on trial.
There has been no news about Habib al-Adli. They keep postponing his trial. In the latest news by Al-Akhbar newspaper, Habib al-Adli said he wants a judicial trial as opposed to a people's trial.
The Egyptian police and the citizens are the two sides of the political equation. Who is the oppressed and who is the oppressor?
The police deserve respect and gratitude. Not all police officers are bad. We can't continue to live without security.
My brother's a martyr. What did these 3 children do to deserve this? What are they guilty of? We want him to be prosecuted.
I was injured during the Friday of Rage on January 28th. I sustained gunfire injuries to my eye. I can no longer see with this eye.
In today's events, the protesters seemed to disagree on everything as scuffles and altercations broke out among them. As usual, the protesters voiced their rejection of Egyptian TV and accused it of portraying those in the square as thugs. Tahrir Square is once again making headlines. Between the Friday of Retribution and the Friday of Martyrs' Rights, many questions remain unanswered. Among them are who brought back the fire to Tahrir Square, and did the revolution stray away from its main objectives, and who is benefiting from this latest Egyptian conflict. I'm Hikmat Abed Hamid for Nile TV.
Libyan rebels, who had advanced to within 80 kilometers of Muammar Gaddafi's stronghold in the capital, were forced to retreat today after coming under a barrage of Grad rocket fire from government forces. The rebels' advance 5 days ago to the outskirts of the small town of Bir al-Ghanam had raised the possibility of a breakthrough in a 4-month-old conflict. The reverse underlines the resilience of Gaddafi's forces, who have withstood 15 weeks of bombardment by NATO missiles and warplanes, and attempts by rebels on 3 fronts to break through their lines. Frustration at the slow progress is growing inside the military alliance, with some members worried about the cost, civilian casualties, and the fact the campaign has now been going on much longer than its backers anticipated. President Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbasogo of Equatorial Guinea and current head of the African Union launched a scathing attack on foreign intervention on the continent at the AU summit he is hosting, saying moves to defend human rights had instead deepened problems. Obiang's thinly veiled criticism appeared to target NATO's operations in Libya, a crisis that is likely to dominate the 2-day summit, alongside Sudan's imminent split. AU Commission President said the AU's position remained that Libyans had to find their own solution to the problem, and the country should not be allowed to divide. The 53-member AU has complained that its efforts to broker peace have been sidelined as the NATO-led bombing campaign continued.
Bahrain, top religious leaders reject any negotiations with the Saudi-backed regime amid an ongoing crackdown on protesters. Senior cleric Sheikh Isa Ghassam says the country's political parties should ask people for permission before holding any talks with the regime. Meanwhile, Bahrain's largest opposition group, Al-Wafaq, has said that it won't engage in futile negotiations. The group organized a massive anti-regime rally in Daraz on Friday. Similar demonstrations have been held in several other cities. New footage shows that the regime forces have been deployed to crush the protests. The crackdown continues across the country despite calls by Bahrain's king, Hamad bin Isa Al Khalifa, for dialogue with the opposition. He has also boasted of his commitment to human rights.
To reinforce Bahrain's continuing commitment to both our domestic and international obligations in respect of human rights, to which we remain fully committed.
The monarch's comments come against the backdrop of an ongoing crackdown on demonstrators peacefully demanding that he and his loyalists hand over the reins of power. This is Majid Mohammed, the latest victim of the Saudi-backed crackdown in the Persian Gulf Sheikhdom. He died of injuries to the head caused by a stun bomb thrown by regime forces in a brutal March 14 attack on anti-regime protesters in Sela. Mohammed is one of dozens killed, some under torture, by Saudi-backed troops in recent months. The king says he has ordered the formation of a panel to probe allegations of rights abuses during the deadly clampdown.
Yesterday I announced the formation of an independent commission of inquiry led by a panel of international experts whose expertise and impartiality are beyond reproach.
The UN has emphasized that the government of Bahrain should not interfere in the work of the investigative commission. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon says the inquiry should be independent.
A boat carrying American peace activists has set sail from a Greek port for the besieged Gaza Strip. The boat, called the Audacity of Hope, has left Greece's Parama for international waters. It's part of an international flotilla of 9 ships that are determined to deliver humanitarian aid to the people in the besieged coastal enclave of Gaza. Earlier, the American activists gathered outside the U.S. Embassy in the Greek capital Athens to protest what they called Washington's efforts to hamper their trip to Gaza. Minor scuffles broke out between Greek police and American activists as they tried to stage a sit-in.
We're trying to put pressure on our government and say you're supposed to be protecting us, American citizens, and not the government of Israel, and that you should be pressuring Israel to say, let this flotilla leave Greece and let this flotilla arrive in Gaza, deliver the letters that we've brought for the people there, and not be obstructed by the Israeli military.
On Thursday, the activists showed their boat to the media to demonstrate the humanitarian nature of their mission.
كشف 4 من عناصر جماعة خلق الإرهابية عن مؤامرات.
4 members of the Mujahideen al-Khalq terrorist group have unveiled plots by the group to launch attacks in Iraq in a bid to disrupt security and stability there, following their escape from the Ashraf camp and surrender to the Iraqi authorities. The 4 men held a press conference at the Iraqi Ministry of Defense. They talked about their ordeal and false imprisonment at the hands of the group's leaders.
داخل وزارة الدفاع العراقية نظم 4 عناصر هاربين من معسكر أشرف.
4 escapees from the Ashraf camp organized a press conference at the Iraqi Ministry of Defense. They talked about the repression and false imprisonment they endured at the camp at the hands of the Mujahideen Khalq terrorist group. The 4 men surrendered to the Iraqi authorities after escaping from the camp.
القوات العراقية بعد أن تمكنوا من اجتياز أسوار المعسكر.
الكثير من سكان المخيم يحاولون.
Many of the camp residents are trying hard to put an end to the chaotic practices facing members of the organization at the hands of its leaders.
We were able to escape and surrender to Iraqi forces. We endured dark days inside the camp. People are being subjected to beatings and even death. This is why we escaped. Thank God we are safe.
The
residents are pleading for international and Iraqi help, urging the authorities to dismantle the dark walls and prisons of the camp. They are calling for the release of hundreds of prisoners and for the exposure of the plots that are being hatched by members of the Mujahideen cult group against the Iraqi people. This, according to some speakers at the press conference.
I urge human rights and humanitarian organizations to intervene. I also urge the Iraqi government to open the walls of the camp in order to rescue the captives who are being held against their will. Khalq is still conspiring against Iraq through dirty intelligence practices.
With these 4 escapees from the Ashraf camp, the number of leaders who are able to escape from the terrorist cult group stands at 58. Meanwhile, many are still being held against their will inside Ashraf's walls and prisons. The Iraqi government is planning to expel this terrorist group from the country at the end of the year. The government is also planning to reclaim Ashraf camp and return some of its land to the farmers and residents whose lands were seized by the group during Saddam's reign. Haider Qasem, Al-Alam, Baghdad.
The views expressed on Mosaic are from contributing broadcasters, not Link TV or its sponsors. The production of Mosaic is made possible by grants from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Firedoll Foundation, and by support of viewers like you. Thank you. Watch Mosaic World News online. Stay up to date with breaking news, read our blog, get transcripts of past shows, and more at linktv.org/mosaic.
This program is brought to you by Link TV for educational and non-commercial use only. Link TV is the only U.S. network dedicated to global and national news, uncompromising documentaries, and diverse cultural programs. Programs which connect you to the world.